All right. Harriet, welcome back to the show. I know it's been a little while, so how are you doing?
I'm well, man. Good to be back. How are you?
I am doing well. Before this weekend, I was exhausted.
I believe it.
Yes, I was in much need of a break because last week my wife and I we went to Vegas. So
Right.
like before that, it's like I was in Europe for two weeks, came back from Europe for like 3 days,
Mm-hmm.
then got on the plane, headed out to Vegas,
Mm-hmm.
and I would say my mind was all thrown off on the time zones.
I'm sure because you hadn't gotten over your European jet lag, and then you went
No,
out west, which was 3 hours behind and hot. Because I don't care when you go to Vegas, it's hot. But no, man, I'm glad that you've had safe travels and all as well.
yes. The travels have been safe. A lot of great perspective and great times. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I saw that you were doing some traveling. I mean, with your nephew enjoying the good life.
I've been
How was
running.
that?
I've been running. Jeffrey and I went on vacation. We went to the Caribbean for a week. You know how it is when you're away from work for a week. I really tried to unplug. I limited myself to 1 hour of work per day. So when I came back, I had a mountain of work to catch up on. Flew back in on a Friday night, Saturday morning. You saw me and my nephew, his spoiled self. We went, I had to go to Atlanta for something. Took him with me, came back from that, tried to catch up for work, had to go back to Atlanta the following weekend, this past weekend. And got back yesterday, and here I am. I got court hearings, depositions, mediations, but thank God for business. So here we are.
Awesome. Well, I will say welcome back. I know that you had a lot going on, and then also to the audience, the people that are watching, whether you're watching this on replay or you're watching this live. You know, we've been reading the comments, and we know that many of you have asked about, hey, when's the next episode coming out, or when's the next conversation? Well, we are having it today, and something that really stood out that I think is a topic that people don't usually hear about. Now, I'll put up the overlay because some people may have seen it on Facebook, but um, this one is because I saw an article out of the UK, and it was an article about a minister. It was in, I forget exactly what church it was, but it minister that was suing the church because the minister, when she had gotten promoted to this position or assigned to this position, she had been under repeated bullying from members within the church. And it's something that I was like, when I read the title, I was like, you know what? You don't really hear many people talk about this. I
Right.
mean, what was your initial thought when you saw the title or when I text you about it?
So my initial thought was, I said, "Wow!" But I can see how it occurs. Now I don't see it occurring a lot in non-denominational churches, where the pastor kind of founds their own church, creates their own board, and people follow them. But I have seen it in denominational churches, where where pastors are getting assigned by denomination, and maybe the powers that be at the church don't necessarily care for them and want them out. And I have seen people, I grew up United Methodist, so I'm just talking about my denomination. I have seen people go to the DS, which is the district superintendent, and say, we don't want this pastor no more. I have seen congregants and church members be very difficult, make the pastor's life a living HELL, and try to push them out. So it happens. And what I have found is that church people can be some of the nastiest people ever, but we're under the auspices of we love God. I think it was Mahatma Gandhi says that I like your Christ. I'm not so sure about your Christians, right? Because they don't model that behavior. So I say all that to say that it happens, and it's unfortunate. But those are the ways that I've seen it. I have seen congregants who, this might be my family church. We've been in this church for 100 years. Pastor, you just was assigned at the last charge conference in June, and we're going to have you out of here by next summer. And we're going to make your time here miserable. You're not going to lead. I've seen congregations tell the pastor, we want you to preach about this. Don't talk longer than 30 minutes, and we have to go. That's bullying to me, right? If God has called his man to give you a word, or this woman, let them do that. But I've seen it, and it happens more than you might think.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, because we're living in this very interesting time now where you see a lot of the older ministers due to health reasons or whatever, are passing away. So someone new that the congregation is not familiar with now is stepping into that role of the pastor. And for some reason, I noticed that there are some members in churches, I think, that feel like their opinion should be, I guess you would say, prioritized
Oh,
above all things.
definitely, even above the Lord. Yes, it happens.
to where they may say things like, well, we prayed and God sent this person to be the pastor, but then a week later they are pressuring this pastor with their own personal opinions. And I think that there are a lot of people, who, unfortunately, I think there are ministers who may show up to do with very good intentions to do the job that they feel like they've been called to, but a lot of times they find themselves handicapped because, hey, there are people who are putting pressure on them. And then even sometimes what I've seen, two common situations I've seen is where they either put pressure on the minister's family and they make it uncomfortable for the minister's family, to where it's just like, I mean, from a religious standpoint, they're saying, well, Bible says, touch not my anointed, but so I'm not going to mess with the pastor, but I'm going to mess with the pastor's family.
Strategic haters, strategic bullies,
just
right?
Straight foolishness.
Yeah, and it happens. It happens. I think that you give the enemy a lot of room. That if the enemy can't frustrate the word going forward, he's going to get behind the scenes and he's going to frustrate the business of the church. And I think you have to be very mindful of that. And so, we've talked a lot of this on this program about pastors and what they can do right or wrong. But I'm glad to hear it from this perspective, because being a pastor is a very hard job. And what you don't need on top of all of those responsibilities is being bullied. Most of the people I know who pastor tell me, I'm friends with tons of pastors, Harry, this is not what I would have chosen for my life. Nobody wakes up and say, hey, I'm going to be a pastor when I grow up. This is what my pastor friends tell me. They are doing this because the Lord has called them to do so. So what you don't need is added job pressure on a position that you didn't even want in the first place.
I totally agree with you, because I always say it's like, I say my personal opinion, I say a similar thing when it comes down to people who are pastors, people who are leaders of nonprofit organizations, and even people in, civic roles, to where if that person said, I always wanted to be in this position, I'm a little hesitant, because I'm just like, a lot of the people that I talk to that are in that position, they went into it for the mission. Like, they had a heart for what the position, what the mission involved with the position, and the position was just part of the process. But people who just wake up and say, hey, I just want to be a pastor. Right. What I have personally seen is those people want it more for the prestige and the power. But when you get an understanding of what all comes with that, I've seen a lot of them say, yeah, this ain't for me anymore.
If you're going to do it the right way, because I take it back, and I hate to talk about people, but if you follow media trends and things that's going on in churches, there's a Bishop Whitehead or somebody out of New York. He's been in the media now for a whole lot of allegations and things. So there are some people who do want to become a pastor, but like you said, typically, 90% of the time, their heart and intentions aren't pure. My opinion, my experience. Because the people who are really going to do it, like you said, no one picks this, right? Yeah. No one automatically said, I want to be subjected to the whims of people. Because let's talk about what pastors have to deal with. It's a political position. Because you want people in the seats on Sunday to yes, encourage them about God, help them get saved, but you need people to pay money so the church can keep going too. It's a business, and it's a very delicate fine line. I've seen people, and I'll give an example with no names. You and I were at a meeting with some pastors, and a parishioner's, not even a member of the church, somebody of the church's family member was ill. And the pastor's like, I need to go to the hospital and pray with these people, because if I don't, then my name is mud. The person who was injured doesn't even go to my church, but the family is there. The expectation and the demands that we put on pastors is sometimes unrealistic. Yeah. And I'm just going to say that I can come across as very matter of fact about church business, but I'm telling you, pastors have a hard job. and they have to get out of their beds that night and go see about your sick and pray about your son, who y'all know out here selling crack. But now that he's been put in jail, you want the pastor to come down there to the police station. And it's like, was little Johnny coming to church on Sunday? But here we go. Because if he doesn't come, then I'm a bad pastor. And so those are a lot of things. You know what I'm saying? Right? Pastors oftentimes, they miss their own family stuff. They miss dinner with their own family. They miss their kids' games and practices because they somewhere praying for your family, ministering to you. And that's challenging. So what you don't need on top of that is people who are ungrateful, unrealistic expectations, expect you to do all of this for nothing, right? Mm-hmm. Right? And then when you don't get your way, you become a bully. Not fair.
Yeah. You know, I think that is so true, because even when I think about during my time, like for 6 years, I served on the staff for a church, and one of the calls I remember, it was a person who was it was a member of the church, and it was her cousin came to visit. It was one of the youth. Her cousin came to visit, and I remember getting a call at like 2:00 in the morning because her cousin, who lived in a completely different state, her cousin lived in Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. Her cousin called me because she got a call from one of her friends at school who was wanting to commit suicide. And it's just like, at that point, I realized, I'm like, you know what, this is part of the job that you don't sign up for. That no one tells you that a visitor is going to have a friend in another state that calls you at 2:00 in the morning because they're freaking out because, you know, someone is wanting to commit suicide. I mean, thankfully, the wisdom of God kicked in to where, like I said, we were able to get a hold of the police in Pennsylvania. Now, I'm in South Carolina. We were able to get a hold of the police in Pennsylvania to get them over to the house to stop the kid before they overdosed on pills, and got in touch with the person's mom. Now, all of this is happening between 2 a.m. and 2:45 a.m. I was asleep. I was sound. Well, I wasn't sound asleep because my phone went off, but I was sleeping in my bed to where I'm just like, I agree with you. Pastors do have a lot to deal with. And I think a lot of times, sometimes when a pastor steps into accepting a position as the pastor or the leader of a church, where I think you and I have talked a lot about is on the governance side, to where there aren't those governance isn't really set in place to protect them from the drama that can happen from bullying and pressuring of members. Because, you know, another situation that I've seen where there's a minister on staff and the minister's wife, who isn't on staff now, is pressuring volunteers and other ministers to do things based on the position of her husband. To where I'm just like, there has to be governance rules in place for that, because, hey, although you're a pastor, you're doing well-meaning things. Is if your family members are putting pressure on people, it's just like those type of things shouldn't be happening in the church, because that could really run good people out of whether it's volunteer or paid positions in the church.
Right.
Now, one of the things that I wanted to go a little bit further in, because I think when people hear the term bullying, because I think you alluded to it a little bit about, you know, how you define bullying. Let's revisit that as far as, you know, how you define bullying, and I'll share my thoughts on how I define bullying as well.
You know, I'm trying to articulate what I believe bullying to be, right? So, hold on. Clearly, I'm Googling bully, and then I'm going to put this into my own definition, right? Okay. All right. So I'm on Merriam-Webster, right? What is bullying? One who is habitually cruel, insulting, or threatening to others who are weaker, smaller, or in some way vulnerable by themselves or position. So my thing is, bullying is, if I had to put that in layman's terms, taking advantage of someone who has in the power dynamic in that situation, right? There could be some vulnerabilities there. If I'm the pastor here, I don't want to hurt feelings. I'm the pastor here, I need to tread lightly. I'm the pastor here, I need to demonstrate the fruits of the Spirit. I often tell people, I am a Christian. Try Jesus, not me, right? Because my response ain't always godly. Working on it, right? But if I'm in the church doesn't pay my bills. So I got a lot more freedom and liberation to tell people, not me, not today. right? A pastor, you cripple by stop laughing at me. As a pastor, you have to be delicate. And words of papa is what it doesn't just come down to a money dynamic. It's just the nature of the position, right? You have to be careful how you move. Not so much for the view, but God is watching you, because I feel like pastors should be held to a higher moral standard. Now, I have seen people try to play on that. I've seen them threaten it like, hey, if you don't do this, you won't be preaching here next month, right? Or you won't be. That's at times not fair. So so kind of that's my all over the place layman's terms. What you got?
I mean, I definitely like, like what you mentioned with Merriam-Webster about, whereas that consistent pressure of taking advantage of someone's vulnerability. And I do think I would say the same thing. It's when someone is using something that, in this context, a pastor, a minister, a leader, is an area where they're vulnerable, using that to pressure them into giving that person what they want, even though it may not even be in that person's best interest. Right. And I would say is when you start to see that or whatever, I always take a step back because in a lot of these bullying situations, and you really start to evaluate, and some of these, you start finding that the person who's doing the bullying, there's some type of power that they want, or they're trying to fill some gap or deficiency within themselves. And I think that, that if those things aren't addressed, there are unfortunately a lot of ministers who probably have potential bullies in their church. Right. They just don't know it yet. Because typically that I see that tend to happen, like where there was a church pastor that I was talking to, where he said, there was a family that used to bring, a lot of, visitors to the church, and they brought some visitors. Some visitors they didn't like something that the pastor said. And the pastor said, okay, this wasn't something new that he was saying. And it wasn't something where he talked to, the leaders within the church or whatever. And based on, what their stance and what their belief as a church was, it wasn't that, hey, they didn't see anything wrong with what was said. But the visitor who came from a completely different denomination had a completely different understanding of, perspective on the scripture, disagreed. And so the person who brought them was like, hey, my visitor that I brought or whatever, putting pressure on me that I should leave here. And if things like this continue to be discussed and stuff like that. And most pastors that I know, their initial response would be, well, then you need to leave.
That's why I can't be no pastor. I'll be like, well, I accept this as your final notice. You be blessed. Goodbye.
But I think the vulnerability for pastors is like, as their pastor, it's just like there is a sense of love and accountability and leadership that you want to provide, especially like as a pastor, if you genuinely feel like, hey, what this person is saying is wrong. Do I coddle them and help them, or do I coddle them, make them feel good about what they're saying, or how do we bring correction back to this? Because I think that becomes a huge vulnerability for a lot of pastors, is when you have to bring correction to a situation. It's a very uncomfortable place to be in, because you're like, I want to be their pastor, of showing love and compassion. I don't want to turn them away from church, but I also want to speak the truth in love. And I think that, there are a lot of, members who may not intend to be a bully, but I think when they start to say things like that, like, hey, if this doesn't change, I'm leaving. And it's just like, okay, is this really a fundamental problem with the church, or is this just you throwing a temper tantrum and you're trying to leverage what you have to get that person to do what you want them to do?
I think it's a controlled power play. I think the pastor in that situation, you need to pray for spiritual wisdom on how the Lord will have you address it. I don't know what the pastor was teaching, but if it's spiritually sound, found in good doctrine in the Bible and justifiable, right? It's not going to cause anybody harm, then you can stand on the word of God. There are ways to disagree. I think that the parishioner bringing the ultimatum was the problem. It could have been approached differently by the parishioner and even with the pastor. It's like, hey, if you want to sit down with me and look at research where this came from, where I got it grounded in Bible, we can. I would hate to lose you, right? But after you sit down with me and I show you where it comes from, if you still feel the same way, then I'm gonna bid you adieu respectfully. And that's how I would advise a pastor who called me with that to handle it. After I talk trash and tell him to kick him out, then I would tell him to write it, right? Because you have to be careful when you're in leadership on how you approach things. You cannot be hot tempered. You cannot say the first thing you feel. But pastors are human, right? But you have to have some emotional intelligence and some self control because people will say you wrong things to you or rub you the wrong way. But how you response matters. But I think that people do take advantage. And so to the parishioner, I thought it was very courageous of the parishioner enough to feel comfortable with the pastor to say, hey, if you don't do this, here's my ultimatum. I think that parishioner just needed to excuse themselves. Yeah. This might not be the ministry for me. Or if you're going to talk to this person, talk to him respectfully, but don't threaten me. You know what I mean? Don't do that.
Because I think that's where a lot of like when you see people who are bullying ministers or leaders, and whether it's a church, even if you're just a nonprofit organization affiliated church or just a non-church related nonprofit, is where you tend to see people giving ultimatums and trying to get you to do something that you had no intentions of doing on your own. And I would say when stuff like that happens, I think that is probably one of the most obvious signs that, hey, this is a bullying situation. And where I think it becomes, as you and I, we've talked about church governance. And the reason why I think this one becomes important, because even in the for-profit world, I have seen situations where someone has said that they've been bullied. They brought it to the attention of the organization. No action was taken. And then that person turned around and sued the company because they voiced it that, hey, this situation has happened, is making me uncomfortable to do my job. No action was taken. Now that organization has opened themselves up to a lawsuit because they didn't take the person's complaint or the person's issue serious. And it made me think about, like, when it comes down to churches, I'm like, I wonder how many churches have a method for if a minister is being bullied or unduly pressured by members. Does the church even have a way for that minister to bring it to the organization's attention?
Excellent point, right? My answers always fall on the denomination party lines. Churches who have been established in denominations for years, who have disciplines and these book of laws and rules that govern the denomination, typically do. What I find a lot of times is in the non-denominational churches, we haven't thought that deep yet into our policies and procedures. But if you get a report of bullying, there needs to be a process where it is escalated to the right governmental authority and control, right? A controlling entity. There needs to be some type of review and investigation and follow-up action, because if there's not, as you say, and this person can prove bullying, and I told it to the person who had apparent authority of the situation, nothing was done, you open yourself up to a huge lawsuit. And in churches, when you come to employment liability and all those things, there's a gray area there, but there could be some liability there, right? Because bullying is causing people emotional harm, people going to therapy. This is before it even gets physical, right? I'm just on the emotional aspect of it. It's real. It causes people anxiety, documented medical things. I sue injured people all the time. And so it's just like, these are legally plausible causes of action that could put a church in hot water if you don't have the policies and procedures in place to address this thing.
Absolutely.
And
absolutely.
A lot of times I've seen, like, I just came across something in the AME church, and it was reported up. It was something with a local pastor. It was reported up to the bishop, who then took it to the AME denomination conference in that region. They had a judicial committee to review things like this. They took it seriously. They had a hearing. They had a court reporter. They got findings. They took it to their conference. The pastor got suspended for a year, but there was action taken, and so this was something between a pastor and a parishioner. But you need to have these things in place, because the person who was the parishioner was like, can I sue the denomination? But you could not, because the denomination took all the right steps to take your complaint seriously, to follow up, to document, and to take action. But not a lot of churches have that together.
Yeah. No, I totally agree because that's one of the things that it stood out to me, like when I originally read that article about the minister who was suing the church because of repeated bullying. And one of the thoughts in my head that came in is, when that person brought this complaint up, what did the organization do when that person brought the complaint up? Because I've seen so many situations, or even in the for-profit world, where someone brought a complaint, the organization didn't do anything, and it's just like, you guys have almost set yourself on a path to have
Right,
to either settle, or you're
right.
going to make a big payout because you obviously did not take the person's complaint serious.
I
And I
think
think that
that's. Go ahead.
I was going to say is, I think that that is an important thing that goes back to when you and I, we talked about, the policies and procedures
Hmm.
of the board of directors, to where I think, for many churches, if you don't have something like that, to where the pastor can bring forth complaints, or the pastor can bring up, hey, here's an issue of something that's going on. I think that is a topic for the board to discuss. Like, hey, what are we going to do to protect our pastor from situations like this?
No, that's very much legit. I was going to say, I think for the churches listening to this, either live or on replay, go back and check your policies and your procedures. Right, check your bylaws. Is there an avenue to address complaints, not just from staff persons to pastors, but complaints of the pastors? And if you do not have something in place, then you should check out getting something in place. Like Terrell, you gave the example of the lawsuit of this in the UK. If that church had followed up, could show policies. This is our protocol when these types of matters happen. These are the actions that we took when this pastor brought this. Then that case would be dismissed. But if they don't have that, like you said, it's going to be a large payout or settlement.
Hmm.
And
Yeah,
right, and I
absolutely.
tell people all the time in litigation, like I advise churches and for-profit clients. Yes, I can defend you, but if somebody's filing a lawsuit in real court, then you spend $15,000-$20,000 in legal fees before we get to a trial, right? And this could all been avoided with some paperwork that would take a lawyer 2 hours or an hour to put together, because we got to stockpile because you do this for a living, or just to have these things in place. Because even if you don't settle, if you go to court and win, you still got to pay to defend yourself. Uh,
Yeah.
and we need to use God's money for God's work, and not on
Yeah.
litigation costs and fees, if we can avoid the same.
Yes, and I will say legal defenses can be expensive. I mean,
Oh God,
my
yeah,
firm, we work with a lot of law firms, so
yeah.
we see the bills that add up. Plus, I serve on a couple nonprofit boards, and there have been some people who have tried to sue board members
Mm-hmm.
for claims that have no finding. I mean, knowing the situation, like I said, being a member of some of these boards, I knew the situation to where I'm just like, this claim doesn't really have finding, but we still, as a board, had to approve, $10,000, $12,000 to
To
support
defend it.
legal fees
Yeah,
to defend it.
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. So real stuff.
And one of the things that I'll also say, to a specific scenario that I've seen happen often, is where you have a minister on staff, but their spouse is the one that is bullying other people, or trying to bully other members. Like, hey, well, my husband is the so and so, is the associate pastor of the church, or my husband is senior pastor, and trying to bully other members on the staff, to where I do think that that is another policy and procedure area where the board can lay out, like, hey, how much authority does the spouse of the people we hire, how much authority do they have? Because, if I think about it in the sense of a for-profit organization, let's say, if you hire an employee, you would never expect their spouse to show up and start telling your other employees what to do. You probably be like, I would probably go to my employee and say, hey, you need to get your spouse under control,
No, that's
or
real.
there will be consequences.
I'm laughing because Jeffrey Lefton will come into my law office and call everybody. That's about we having a meeting. I say, hey, Jeffrey Lefton don't sign your paychecks, but he be playing. But no, he's playing. But in real life, it happens all the time, and so your parishioners feel obligated to listen to the pastor's spouse because it's the pastor's spouse. but that can make for a very hostile work environment, right? And then you tiptoe, right? Because you don't want to tell the pastor about their spouse, but it's interfering in what you need to do day to day. That's a problem. So I think it's very important to have those boundaries spelled out of what they can and cannot do.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I think all in all, I mean, the what we go back to is, for the board of directors, I think this is a great opportunity for the board or the leadership team to play a role in protecting the pastor. Having policies and procedures that address things like this. I mean, especially in this, social media world that we live in, people
Mhm.
get pretty brave behind a keyboard.
Always
Um,
call them email
so
gangsters.
Yes, and one of the things that I think that for we said for pastors is the job is already difficult enough to
Mhm.
where there should be a follow-up process for, hey, if the pastor is repeatedly getting pressure, an undue pressure from members or people that are visiting, like the board should care enough to say, hey, we need to have a process for how we step in and we address this, because the pastor won't be able to do their job if they're getting undue pressure from members or other people within the organization, because it will stop us from being able to achieve the mission of impacting the lives of other people. So highly recommend that you guys, I think, Harriet, we probably need to like create like this outline of like, hey, here's what should be in your policies and procedures. Here's some
I agree.
common things that
Right,
people don't talk about in policies and procedures, and
right,
dealing with complaints. Like that's one I've looked at a lot of policies and procedures, and I have not seen a lot of churches have that built in.
right. And having the procedures in place when you're in smaller churches, or churches where there are familiar connections, but there are boundaries and lines of separation that address conflicts of interest, right? So I don't need the pastor's wife or husband reviewing disciplinary complaints about the pastor. So it needs to be very carefully spelled out so there are no conflicts of interest. But yeah, that might be a good thing for us to put together a quick checklist of what your policies and bylaws should contain.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, wanted to say thank you guys so much for tuning in. We will be back again with another conversation, but until next time, we will see you guys later.
Thank you.